After marrying the disabled prince of the enemy country author, New Miao copy, Leg, the little princess of the state of Li, is charming and charming, with a color like a begonia. However, once the country was destroyed, she stepped on the bones, crawled out of the blood-drenched purgatory, and was responded by the enemy's domestic Huo Su, a childhood sweetheart who had been a proton in Li state since childhood, brought him back to Qi state. Huo Su looked at her with affection. Zhizi, help me pull the prince down. You will be my only queen in the future. Leg pretended to let go of his blood feud, and smiled. The prince of Qi, Huo Du, looks like an immortal, but his right leg is disabled. He has a sinister personality and acts insane. One day, his father, the emperor, conferred marriage and gave him the princess of the defeated country. Huo Du sneered, Huo Su's little green plum? Beauty plan? Tisk, his imperial brother is really willing. He raised his hand and stroked the white cat on his lap. Oh, you have a toy. Huo Su is a person who is bright on the outside, greedy on the inside, greedy for power, greed for position and greedy for beauty. The crown prince, the beloved little green plum, all this is under his control. He is very satisfied. Until he was tied to a prison post. And his imperial brother bent his lips and handed the knife to his sweetheart, and said with a smile, kill, you can stab as many knives as you want. While he was shocked, he saw that Huo Du turned the tip of his knife to his heart, and slowly said to Lazi, or do you want to kill me first? That's fine. Huo Su's pupils trembled. Did he hear it wrong, or was his imperial brother crazy? Pseudosoft and subjugated princess times really crazily criticizes the disabled prince reading instructions 1. CC, 1v1, he. 2. The male protagonist is crazy and nervous and male Durban outstanding graduates. 3. The male partner is a scumbag, chasing his wife in the crematorium, and the ashes are raised and the dog won't eat it. 4. Sweet and Chuangwen, the male protagonist's leg disease will be cured. Highlighted. 5. Overhead, super empty, don't worry about it. Content tags, court marquee, a match made in heaven, sweet text, revenge, abuse, scum. Search keywords, protagonist, Leg, Huo Du supporting role, poke the column. 1 sentence introduction, your revenge, I hand the knife. Concept, even if the beginning is not good, the ending can be reversed and walk hand in hand. In the morning, the sky is bright. It was the middle of winter, and the cold wind was lingering. Even if the doors and windows of the inn are closed, the cold wind can still get in through the cracks in the door. Leg pretended to be asleep on the bed until the maid and Xi Po woke her up. Dressed up and organized. It didn't take long for a beautiful hibiscus face to be printed on the bronze mirror, and the most eye-catching thing was the charming fox eyes. There was always a festive smile on Madame Xi's face, while the maid Li Yao brought her a cup of pear soup. The weather has been cold and dry recently, and Lazi's throat is often dry and coughing. But today, I can't stop coughing. She took a small sip of the pear soup, raised her eyes slightly, and looked out the window. The warm sun is gradually revealing, illuminating the yard. The handymen and servants in the inn all got up, and the sound of footsteps came in small voices, accompanied by some whispered discussions. Hey, you said that the princess in the house will be given to the prince by the prince. What nonsense! This time is a marriage bestowed by His Majesty, no matter what, it's a crown princess, isn't it? Who knows? Who can guess that His Royal Highness is doing? That's true. It's not like the third prince, a gentleman, gentle like jade. The discussion gradually faded away, and Leg still had a faint smile on his face, but there was a hint of disgust in his drooping eyes. A humble gentleman? Warm as jade? Ah! Suddenly, Li Yao Dabu walked towards her and said softly, Miss, the third prince is here. Hearing this, Leg was slightly startled. Rao is a month past, and she is still a little unfamiliar with this name. In the past 16 years, she has been used to being called princess, little princess. The country of Kelly no longer exists. No, don't think about it anymore. She kept pulling her thoughts back. Li Yao and Xi Po have quietly exited the house, and the familiar footsteps sounded behind them. Today, he should accompany the Emperor and Empress of Qi to pray for blessings at Huguo Temple. But Coke Branch knew that he would definitely come. Suppressing the wetness in his eyes from memories, Lazi turned around and smiled as usual. A man wearing a dark blue cotton cloak walked in from outside the house, and also brought the cold wind of midwinter into the house. The cold air penetrated into the nose and mouth, and Li's throat felt a pain. Seeing this, the man hurriedly closed the door and walked towards her quickly. "Are you all right, Zhizi?" Li raised his head, his handsome face was close at hand. Although none of the facial features on this face is unforgettable, they can be combined together to make people unable to take their eyes off of them. This is the face she has seen for 12 years. "It's all right." Li smiled and called to him, "Brother Aksu." A look of surprise flashed across Huo Su's face. "It's been a long time since my brother heard her call. Hearing it today feels like a lifetime away." He was stunned for a while, silent for a while, and subconsciously asked, "Do you hate me?" The corners of Li's raised lips froze there. After a pause, she lowered her eyes slightly and replied softly, "I hated it." The slender crow eyelashes covered her drooping eyes, and also blocked the flash of light in her eyes. This answer is very ingenious. It does not say that there is no falsehood to hate, nor does it say that hate is decisive. Hated, on behalf of once hated, but has passed. Zhizi. There was a slight tremor in the gentle voice. Li raised his eyes, smiled and shook his head at him, "But I have come to understand a lot this month. Brother Aksu, although I still blame you, I can understand your difficulty." A warmth flowed through his heart, and Huo Su's eyes were finally stained with a smile. It seems that the branches are still the delicate branches. On the day when Li Guo broke into the city, her eyes were red, and the scene of scolding him hoarsely seemed to be just a fantasy. It's just that, after 12 years of childhood sweethearts, the Emperor of Li Kingdom recruited him as his son-in-law at Lazi's wedding ceremony. But today, he has to watch her get married. The bright red wedding dress hurt Huo Su's eyes, and that gorgeous face made his heart tremble. How much he wanted to hold her in his arms, rub it into his bones and love her, just like in countless dreams. However, he can't. Out of the corner of the screen, Li's right ear was empty. Huo Su slowly approached the dressing table, picked up the remaining Baha'i red agate earrings on the table and put them on for her. Then he squatted down in front of her, his eyes filled with affection. "Zhizi, help me pull the prince down. You will be my only queen in the future." From his affectionate eyes, Li could see his hidden ambition and impetus. And she, to be precise, is her face that everyone is famous for, a chess piece in his hand to ask for directions. She smiled and answered him softly, "Okay." After she finished speaking, she saw Huo Su's face rise with joy, and then he got up and opened his arms towards her, as if he was about to come and hug her. The stomach suddenly rolled up. Nausea. Fortunately, someone outside knocked on the door lightly at this time. "His Royal Highness, if you don't leave again, the Emperor and the Queen should be suspicious." Huo Su's face sank instantly, and his arms were put down reluctantly. "I sneaked out of Huguo Temple today, just to see her. At this time, it was too late. Then I'm leaving." A worried look appeared on his face. "Protect yourself, Huo Du. He's a wicked wolf." Li was stunned for a moment, then nodded again. Holding the fan, Li was supported by Xi Po and Li Yao and slowly walked out of the house. The warm sun shines brightly, illuminating the fan that covers the front. Li stared at the pair of double flying winged birds embroidered with gold thread on the fan with no expression. It can be seen that the embroidery lady's embroidery work is excellent, and the lingering affection between a pair of lovers and birds is fully revealed on the fan. Leg seems to have just reacted married. Today is the big day for her to get married. But, where does the joy come from? Girl, watch your steps. Li Yao's reminder brought her thoughts back, and Leg saw Zai Yu, who was golden and red, and the mighty royal welcome team through the fan. After the Emperor Qi, he specially chose to go to the Huguo temple to pray for blessings on the day of the prince's wedding, not just to tell the civil and military people of the Manchu dynasty and the people of Liman how unappreciated the prince was. Having been in Qi for more than a month, Leg knew very little about this prince. Apart from listening to the servants chatting about his right leg and his eccentric temperament, and Huo Su's repeated dignified warnings, she knew nothing about the rest. She didn't dare to ask. A princess of a subjugated country, she must not go beyond the rules, she just needs to obey obediently. Sitting on Zai Yu, the team moved forward slowly. The post station was outside the capital city, and it took a while to enter the city gate. There are luxurious bead curtains hanging down on both sides of Zai Yu, Lazi slightly sideways, looking at the people standing on both sides watching the expressions on their faces vary from mockery, laughter, and even pity. It's just that there is no festivity at all. This is very different from when Huo Su returned from victory a month ago. At that time, she was sitting in the last carriage, covered in blood. The cheers from outside to congratulate the third prince on his victory and return to the court one after another, shocked her eyes red. The curtain swayed with the carriage, and she glanced out. The people did not hide the joy on their faces and the pride that overflowed their eyes. That is the pride of a victorious nation. Looking back, Leg's face became even paler. Finally, Zai Yu crossed the main street, entered the palace, and finally stopped in front of the hall. Leg supported Li Yao's arm and got off Zai Yu. At this time, a good-looking guard hurriedly approached, stopped after a distance from her, and saluted respectfully, "Chen Angxuan, see the crown princess. His Royal Highness has inconvenient legs and feet, so I sent a minister to send you a message, but he won't come over." Salute. On the day of the big wedding, the groom's official did not show up, which was a great humiliation for ordinary women. Hearing this, Li Yao, who was beside him, couldn't help but frown. The coke branch was calm, and said softly, "Okay, it's okay." Such a reaction made An Xian stunned, but in a short while, he regained his indifference, bowed his head and left. Humiliation? Perhaps it was humiliation for the woman next to her. Cola Branch didn't feel it, because she had already experienced the greatest humiliation. It's alright if the prince doesn't come, otherwise it's not good if something goes wrong when he sees him. Leg breathed a sigh of relief and walked to the high platform step by step until he stood at the highest point. She turned and looked down at the civil and military officials below, listening to them bowing without expression, and then saying congratulatory words in unison. Completed this canonization ceremony alone without an emperor and no prince. In the wedding room of the East Palace, the red candles flickered, and the room filled with fragrance. Sitting on the wedding bed, Leg listened carefully to the noise from the wedding banquet outside with empty eyes. She asked Li Yao to retreat. Although Li Yao took care of her carefully and thoughtfully this month, after all, it was the person Huo Su sent to take care of her, how could she dare to believe it? She was alone in the huge bedroom, quiet and deserted. I don't know how long it took, and finally a small sound came from outside. Leg quickly picked up the fan on his side, covering his face. When she heard the door closing, her heart sank again nervously. Because she knew that Huo Du had come in. The hand holding the fan trembled involuntarily. "Is it tiring to lift?" A clear voice was accompanied by a chuckle. Since he said so, Leg slowly put down the fan. But he lowered his eyes but dared not look directly at him, but raised his eyes slightly. "Is he standing?" Leg was dumbfounded, thinking that his leg disease must be very serious, and he should be in a wheelchair. But he was just leaning on a beautiful white jade crutch in his right hand, and his body was slightly inclined, and the back of the hand he held at the top of the crutch was perfectly white against the red dress, and it was not inferior to the white jade. "Come and sit." Li's heart trembled slightly, and she slowly got up and walked to the wedding table to sit down, never daring to look up at him from beginning to end. Until a skeletal hand handed a cup of red bean soup to her. She hesitated for a moment before reaching out to take it. As he opened his mouth to thank him, he raised his eyes and finally saw his face clearly. Li Ziwen was mentally prepared, and judging by the looks of Emperor Qi and Huo Su alone, Huo Du would definitely not be ugly. But I never imagined that it was such an exiled appearance as depicted by a painter. Doesn't seem like a mortal person. The bridge of his nose is tall and straight, his thin lips are slightly pursed, and the most memorable thing at first sight is his pair of peach blossom eyes that seem to be drunk but not drunk. On the wedding night, there was no alcohol on his body, only a faint cool fragrance, which Lizzie had never smelled before. Su Shi stared at her for a long time, and Li noticed that Huo Du was also looking at her, with a faint smile on the corner of his mouth. She hurriedly lowered her head and picked up the silver spoon to drink the red bean soup. But the eyes are still raised from time to time, secretly looking. Huo Du eats very well and moves slowly. Soon, he put down the silver spoon. Li's heart was tense, and he didn't have much appetite, so he put down the spoon. Next, what to do? Cup? Shuttle? But Huo Du didn't seem to mean that. He just walked to the bathroom on crutches. After a while, he put on the red bedclothes and walked out without even giving her a look, and walked straight to the happy bed. Li was stunned, so he had to go to the bathroom, put on his heavy wedding clothes, and simply freshen up. She wondered in her heart, in the Great Eastern Palace, His Highness the Crown Prince didn't even have a maid or to serve in close quarters. Could it be that he does not like to be served? When she came out, she saw Huo Du leaning on the happy bed, holding a book in his hand, looking through it seriously. On the wedding night, he actually read a book? Lizzie was puzzled. She recalled what she had learned in the past 3 days in her mind. The palace specially sent an old maid to teach her etiquette for the prince's wedding. In addition to the royal etiquette of Daki, Mama also explained to her in detail all the things that should be paid attention to on the wedding night, for example, how to please the husband, how to let the husband play with it at will. Thinking of this, her eyes were a little sore, and her cheeks began to heat. However, she couldn't back down. Today, dignity is too extravagant for her. She approached him slowly, trying her best to pull out a charming smile. After a long time, Huo Du seemed to have just remembered her. He raised his eyes to look at her, and pointed to the distance. Li looked along the line of sight, it was the direction of the warm pavilion. Is he going to let her go to sleep in the warm pavilion? Li breathed a sigh of relief, nodded, turned and walked towards the warm pavilion. At the moment she turned around, the person behind her pursed her lips, a sneer appeared on her face, and a very thin silver needle was vaguely caught between his fingers. He stared at Lizzie's footsteps and counted silently, 1 step, 2 steps. When I was about to count 3 steps, my fingers also tightened. However, Li stopped. She only took 2 steps forward, then turned and walked back. Standing in front of Huo Du again, looking at his expressionless face, Li smiled lightly, his fox eyes seemed to be able to speak. Huo Du chuckled, "Want to sleep with me?" Li was stunned for a breath. His tone was casual, and he didn't even call himself orphan. She nodded meekly and hummed softly. Then, Huo Du spread his hands towards her, revealing his pure white palms. Li took a deep breath, lowered his eyes and put his trembling hands on his palms. His sweaty palms touched a piece of ice. "But, it will hurt." The clear voice came into my ears, and the teachings of the old lady and the vivid patterns in the picture albums poured into my mind. Then, the hands were clenched tightly. Li's heart trembled instantly, and his face was as pale as the moon. It was late at night, and there was a muffled low cry from the bedroom, accompanied by a trace of forbearance. And the servants who were waiting outside the hall didn't even lift their eyelids. Who would dare to say more about His Royal Highness? Leg lay on the outside of the happy bed, letting tears flow from the end of her red eyes, but did not raise her hand to wipe it. To be precise, I can't raise my hand. She finally realized what Huodu meant by the phrase "it will hurt." But it was not what she expected. He just clenched her hand, and violently removed both of her arms. It hurts so much. She didn't want to cry, but it was so painful that she couldn't hold back her tears, and she burst out. And the culprit was lying on the side of the bed at the moment, with his back to her. After a long time, neither of them spoke. Leg thought that Huodu was asleep, but she couldn't. Her dislocated arm hurt so bad, she didn't even have a quilt. The high bed is very large, and the stacked high quilts are neatly placed on the innermost side of the high bed. After taking off her arm, Huodu casually pulled a happy quilt and put it on him, but he didn't leave a trace of kindness to cover her with a kindly. Will he have this? Leg looked sideways at the back of his head, his eyes hated. Can't sleep. Leg shivered in shock, thinking that this person also has eyes on the back of his head, right? She didn't hear her answer, and Huodu spoke again, with a lazy tone, "If you're not used to it, go to sleep in the warm pavilion." The bed curtain swayed slightly, and just after Lazi lay down on the bed, Huodu gently waved his hand, and the two bed curtains fell and closed, but there was still a gap. The red candle outside has not yet burned out. On the night of the big wedding, the red candle will not go out and will burn until dawn. The candle light penetrated into the bed with the slightly moving bed curtain, reflecting the flickering light and dark inside the bed. Leg carefully pondered the meaning of Huodu's words, but still couldn't guess what he meant. It's just that it's really stupid to go to the sleeping warm pavilion after even the arm has been removed. She didn't think about it, didn't answer, just slowly moved her body to the side of the bed. For every point of movement, the stinging pain from the dislocated bone increased by 1 point. Until she gently pressed her face against Huodu's back. With a thin layer of bedding. This move seemed to tell him silently that she would not go to the warm pavilion, she would sleep with him. Lazi. This was the first time he called her name, in a light tone. The heart of the coke stick was called to the drum. Calm down. Leg froze for a moment. Such a clear tone, as if she was accusing her of something that offended him. She pursed her lips and moved her slightly hot cheeks away. Afraid that Huodu would chase her away again, she muttered softly, "I'll sleep here." I don't know if it was an illusion, Leg heard a faint chuckle in a trance. Then, when she saw Huodu turning to the outside, she was so frightened that she quickly closed her eyes. Just now she dared to do such a bold move, partly because Huodu had his back to her. But that doesn't mean she's not afraid of him. The fear of his arm being removed is still there, and Leg is afraid to die. How dare he look at him? As for why she had to fall asleep with him, it was because she also had a plan in her heart. And whether this plan is feasible, she has not yet judged at this moment. Although her eyes were tightly closed, Kola Branch could still feel Huodu's burning gaze, so her crow's eye could not help but tremble. But after a while, her long eyelashes stopped fluttering. Because Huodu tapped her sleeping point. He lifted his palm slightly, and the two bed curtains were swept away by the internal force. A large piece of candlelight penetrated into the red account, making Lazi's snowy cheeks extraordinarily translucent. Huodu raised his eyes slightly. Truly a rare beauty in the world. It's a pity that it was Huosu's. He hooked his lips and put his palm on Lazi's snow neck. As long as he exerted a little force, she would never wake up again. The cold fingers slowly curled up, but Huodu suddenly stopped. If you twist your neck, your head will be crooked. The death of a beauty should not be too ugly. He frowned slightly, as if thinking seriously about a way to die that would have the best of both worlds. Suddenly a meow sounded. A group of Snow White jumped on the happy bed skillfully, but its right hind leg seemed weak, and it almost fell down before it could stand firm on the bed. Huodu's indifferent lacquer eyes flashed panic, and he quickly reached out and carried the Snow White ball over. The Snow White dumpling was frightened, his whole body was fried, and he called out meow 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 several times. "I'm not careful, how dare you get angry?" Huodu lightly poked its head and reprimanded in a low voice. The Snow White dumpling finally raised his head, revealing round, innocent cat eyes. "This is a white Persian cat." Huodu looked at it for a moment, and suddenly realized. He lowered his eyes and said with a low voice, "I'm sorry, I said it was your toy, so life and death are naturally up to you." After he finished speaking, he threw the snowball to Lizzie's side, and then carefully observed its reaction. I saw Xiao Tuanzi first looked at Li's face curiously, then leaned against her arm and rubbed his face. Seeing that the sleeping person didn't respond, it yawned and leaned lazily against her shoulder. Seeing this, Huodu's face couldn't help but show a hint of surprise. This little thing has never been close to strangers, but at this time, he obediently sleeps next to Lizzie. He stretched out his fingertips and tapped the little dumpling's head, sneering, "The little with no prospects." After a while, he whispered, "Okay." In the middle of winter night, there is no warmth in the bedroom. The chill was piercing to the bone, but there was no stove in the bedroom. The sleeping snow mass suddenly trembled. Huodu took a happy quilt from the side of the bed and covered it. The high quilt is very large, only a small quilt is needed to cover it, and the rest will naturally fall on Li's body. In these days in Qi state, Li couldn't sleep peacefully every night. As soon as she closed her eyes, those and terrifying scenes were overwhelmingly presented in front of her eyes. She couldn't sleep, and was more afraid of falling asleep. But this sleep, Li slept deeply and long, and had no dreams all night. The sky is bright, the warm sun is hanging high, and the bright sun shines in from the window, caressing the closed eyelids of Lizzie. The eyelids tremble slightly, and she gradually opens her eyes. Look dazed. Suddenly, a fluffy feeling came from the neck. Li turned her head to the side and saw a mass of Snow White rubbing her neck. Seeing her wake up, Xuetuan stopped and looked at her with wide eyes. Li blinked, smiled involuntarily, raised his hand and rubbed its little head. "Where did you come from?" Meow. After Xuetuan rubbed Lizzie's palm with his head, he jumped off the bed and limped away. "What?" Li stood up, the smile on her face solidified. She whispered softly, "Is the leg hurt?" After being stunned for a while, Li seemed to remember. She suddenly raised her arm. When was her arm connected? As his thoughts gradually returned, Li looked at the spacious and unfamiliar bedroom, where the most prominent pair of red candles on the wedding table had already been burned out. The sun outside the window is getting brighter and brighter, but there is not even a sound outside the hall. She turned to look inside the bed. Huodu was still there. He leaned on the soft pillow, still holding the book from last night in his hand. Li subconsciously looked at his right leg and bit his lip secretly. She woke up so late, Huodu had inconvenience in his legs and feet, and he slept on the inside, so he couldn't get on the bed at all, right? With such a ruthless temperament, he didn't push her directly to the bed. He got up and stayed in a hurry. Li put his hand in, and said sincerely, "I'm sorry, I made your highness wait for a long time." After hearing this, Huodu raised his eyelids, put down the book with a sullen expression, glanced at her palm, and smiled. "What? Does the crown princess think that the lame can't sleep by herself?" Cold sweat broke out on Li's forehead, afraid that he would touch his taboo, and he forgot to take his hand back for a while. But the next moment, Huodu placed his palm lightly on her forearm and said, "It really can't be. 3 souls and 7 souls could be returned to their places." Li supported him on the bed, and handed the collapsed white jade crutch to his hand. With the crutches as support, Huodu stood up and thanked Lazi with a very gentle smile. Then I went to the bathroom. When he came out, he had changed into a moon-white satin robe, and the hibiscus flowers on the cuffs were very delicately embroidered, which made him look taller and taller. It was not until he walked out of the bedroom that Leg finally breathed a sigh of relief. Spreading his palms, he was already sweating slightly. After a while, Li Yao came in and waited on her to wash up and change her clothes. When Li Yao pulled her hair into a bun, her stomach rang since yesterday. Lazi has only drank some pear soup and red bean soup. Master must be hungry. Li Yao put the step on her, leaned over to help her up. This servant will take you to the dining room. The East Palace and the West Courtyard were surrounded by a few palace maids. Laughter came and went, and surrounded by the middle was an old palace maid. Her face was covered with traces of years of trial and error. She held a cup of tea in her hand, her expression was cold and she did not speak. Until a childish little palace maid came swiftly from a distance. Jingzhen, what's the matter? Gong Mao said, with a forceful tone in her voice. The palace maid, who was called Jing Xin, had flushed cheeks and was panting. She lowered her head and said, "Look, see clearly." Her breath was unsteady, and her voice was like the chirping of mosquitoes. Then say it quickly. A palace maid next to her in a pale yellow palace dress raised her hand to grab Jing Xin's arm and said sharply. She pinched it so hard that Jing Xin's eyes were flushed, and she shrugged and replied, "That's no pup. Shui handbag is as white as new." Ha ha ha. The palace maid laughed, and then released her hand on Jing Xin's arm, and Jing Xin hurriedly took 2 steps back to stay away from her. "Mommy, I said that the princess can't make it. Look, His Royal Highness doesn't want to touch her." "That's right. Mammy, I think she just hangs up a name and can't change your status." The palace maids were full of tongues and flattery. Hearing this, Gong Mao took a sip of tea with a contemptuous smile on her face. "It seems that I am overthinking it." After a pause, she deliberately sighed again. "People are old and useless, they are easy to worry." Seeing this, a few palace maids understood, and continued to say what you said, trying to please. Mama Gong smiled with satisfaction, and the big stone in her heart gradually let go. She has been in the palace for decades, and she has been a steward in the East Palace for more than 10 years. This is a bad thing, really. The prince lives in the prince's mansion outside the palace for a long time, and rarely comes to the East Palace. In the East Palace, she is almost the one who has the final say. So after hearing that His Majesty bestowed the marriage of the prince, she panicked. The crown princess entered the East Palace, and she might live here for a long time after her big wedding. If this is the case, then the stewardship of the East Palace must be handed over to the crown princess. I am used to the benefits of power, but now I have to hand it over. How could she be reconciled? Fortunately, that crown princess is not a noble status, but a princess of a subjugated country, and her family has no power to rely on, so she is not much better than them. The dignity of the women in this palace depends to a large extent on the power of their parents. Having said that, but after she sent someone to inquire about it, she learned that the princess of Li Kingdom looks like a fairy. She was distraught again. If His Royal Highness takes a fancy to it, it will be different. Even if her family has nothing to rely on, the prince can be her support. And she is just a slave, how can you compare? However, that snow pouch is as white as new. On the wedding night, the prince didn't want to touch her, so how disgusting should he be? A heart finally settled down. "Mammy, Mammy!" the palace maid said with a wicked smile, "then what should we do next? Where is the crown princess now?" She looked at Jing Xin again. Jing Xin, who had been drooping her head all the time, raised her eyes slightly. The crown princess was still grooming when the slave and maid left. "I'm probably going to the dining room now." In this case, then we naturally have to prepare a hearty breakfast for the crown princess. Several palace maids were stunned for a moment before they reacted. Then they covered their mouths and snickered. It seems that Mammy is planning to stand in front of this newly arrived crown princess. The Queen of Qi State prayed for blessings in Huguo Temple and returned to the palace tomorrow, while the Empress Dowager was lingering on the sick bed, and it has been a long time that no one will come to greet him. So today is free. Leg wore a thick light apricot-colored RU skirt, and Li Yao brought her a sleeve stove. After she held it tightly, she felt her body gradually warm up. She didn't dare to ask Huodu why there was no heater in the bedroom. Isn't he cold? Wrong. Obviously his palm is so cold, how can it not be cold? But Huodu's temperament is so weird, more things are worse than less things. After arriving at the dining room, Leg couldn't help but be dumbfounded. Where's the slightest bit of smoke in here? There's only one plate on the dining table, leaf. The bleak cold wind blew in from outside the dining room, and the stabbing cold felt all over Lazi's body. Slave, see the crown princess. Leg turned around and saw an elderly palace maid, followed by a few little palace maids. Lazi nodded, as a response to their greetings. Who are you? Mammy Li was startled at first, although she had sent someone to inquire about it before. She didn't expect it to be so dazzling with picturesque eyebrows, pink carvings, and jade carvings. People are really more delicate than flowers. The state of Qi is located in the north, and most of the women are majestic and magnificent, unlike the state of Li, which is located in the south, and the women are much gentler and more beautiful. It seems true that Li Guo has beautiful women. It's just, where is the country of Li now? But it became a territory of Qi state. The slave's surname is Li, and she is the steward of the East Palace. Her tone was cold and distant, and there was contempt in her eyes. Leg knew it in his heart, but he wasn't annoyed. It turned out to be Mama Li. Prince Concubine hasn't had breakfast yet. Mammy Li's mouth twitched with mockery. Please eat quickly. Leg sat down at the dining table and asked, Can your highness have a meal? Mammy Li didn't expect this crown princess to be so calm at such a young age. She thought that she recognized her position and did not dare to be arrogant in the East Palace. Naturally I have used it. Your highness is accustomed to using only this night-scented incense for breakfast. Hearing this, Leg frowned. Huodu only eats this leaf for breakfast? No wonder the fairy spirit is fluttering. She picked up the silver chopstick, sandwiched a piece, and put it in front of her nose to sniff it, as if it was the smell she had smelled on Huodu last night. I nibbled at the tip of the leaf with my shell teeth. The cool taste spreads on the tip of the tongue, with a little weird spicy. Unappetizing. Too bad to eat. I didn't expect this thing that smelled so peacefully to be so hard to swallow. Leg put down the silver chopstick and frowned. Li Yao frowned on the side, and it seemed that they were deliberately teasing people. She raised her eyes to Mammy Li and said, The crown princess is from the south, and her eating habits are different. Please, Mammy, ask someone to make some hot food. She was neither humble nor arrogant. But Mammy Li said deliberately, This is difficult to do. His Royal Highness never likes to add hot food to breakfast, if the crown princess insists on adding it. Li Yao's hands trembling with anger to dispose of his master like this is too bullying. She wanted to speak again, but was pulled by Leg. If that's the case, then it's the same as His Highness. Leg smiled, but there was no smile in his eyes. Mama Li has worked hard, let's go. It's too much. Looking at Li Yao's back, Li Yao gritted his teeth. She just bullied you on purpose. Leg smiled, so what? Now, in an enemy country, anyone can step on her as a princess of a subjugated country. Could it be Huodu's intention to be able to show off his might in the East Palace? No problem, no problem. As long as you live, you will come to Japan. There is still some dry food in the servant's house, the servant will go and get it. Before the words fell, the little girl ran out. Leg's face was slightly condensed, and he sighed and shook his head. It would be great if Li Yao hadn't been sent by Huosu. Suddenly, a smell of fish wafted up, and Leg was suspicious, so he got up and walked out of the dining room following the scent. The smell of fish was at its strongest until it reached a room. Leg thought for a moment, then gently opened the door. The furnace in the house is burning hot, warm like spring, and accompanied by a strong fish fragrance. She turned her eyes and finally saw the person inside. No, it's the cat inside. Xioxu dumplings, whom I had only seen in the morning, were lying lazily on the low table. Seeing her opening the door, Xuetuan stood up immediately and ran towards her, still limping and running very slowly. Don't run, don't run. Leg quickly walked over, squatted down, and rubbed its little head. So you live here? Meow meow. Lazi picked it up and sat down at the low table, looking at a table of fish-made meals: fried fish, dried small fish, grilled fish, fish soup. And it's all deboned fish. Smelling the smell of fish, the snowball in his arms jumped to the table and started to eat fried fish, making a satisfied meow while eating. You little guy, really happy? Leg touched his empty stomach and smiled with emotion. She knew that this little white cat must have been raised by Huodu, otherwise, how could she enter and leave the prince's bedroom at will? Seeing its meal at this time, she was even more sure. Snowball ate quickly, and suddenly shook his head vigorously as if choked by fish. Lazi raised his hand and followed the back of its neck, then picked up the silver spoon and fed it a mouthful of fish soup before it swallowed the fish stuck in its throat. Golem Leg's stomach rang again. In fact, she wasn't very hungry, she was already too hungry after thinking about it. But Xuetuan put down the dried fish and looked at her with round eyes. Seeing this, Lazi nodded its head and said deliberately, "What? You're sorry that I don't have any food to eat?" Xuetuan seemed to understand, shaking his head and meowing. That's it. Leg deliberately picked up a small dried fish and shook it in front of its eyes. Why don't you share with me? Xuetuan didn't respond, but round eyes looked towards the door. Leg is surprised, is someone here? Then, the familiar laughter sounded behind him, grab food with the cat. Leg hurriedly turned around and saw Huodu sitting in a wheelchair made of white jade, looking at her with peach blossom eyes. She was stunned, and the slender fingers holding the dried fish unconsciously loosened. The dried fish fell, impartially, and hit Xuetuan's head just right. The terrified meow sounded, and Leg hurriedly squatted down to see the snowball. I saw it raised its cat claws and wanted to rub its head, but unfortunately its front legs were too short to reach. Lazi reached out and rubbed its head with shame. After Xuetuan pushed her head against her palm, she ran to Huodu. Huodu picked up the snowball and put it on his lap, then looked at Leg and asked, "How long have you been in Qi country?" Leg stared at his face, but could not see that he showed the slightest emotion. Even since the two met last night, every action and every word he said made her unable to understand. She slowly walked closer to him, saluted respectfully, and replied, "It's been more than a month since I returned to His Highness. To be precise, it was the 37th day. 1 month." Huodu chuckled, "Do you still remember who you are?" Hearing this, Leg was slightly startled. During this period of time, everyone avoided mentioning Li Guo in front of her, and no one called her princess again. She knew that they all wanted her to forget, and it would be good to forget it cleanly. Especially Huosu. But how could she forget? She is the youngest third princess in the country of Li. She bears the blood feud of her relatives and people, and she still has relatives to save. How to forget? Unforgettable. But what Huodu said was to remind her not to forget the identity of the princess. Or is it just a test? After thinking for a while, Leg nodded lightly and said softly, "Remember, I am His Highness's crown princess." After a pause, she frowned slightly, realizing she had lost her words, and hurriedly added, "Concubine, the concubine is His Highness's crown princess." She came to Qi country for more than a month, and she learned the etiquette very well, but she was easy to forget the title. Huodu looked at her drooping fox eyes and listened to her evasive answer, but stopped asking questions. Only said, "In my case, the title is not important." Ah! The beauty is restrained, which is boring. If you are so afraid of him, when will you dare to attack him? He has to help her. Leg didn't answer. Fortunately, An Xian came at this time. He nodded and said, "Your Highness, everyone is here. Let's go, lonely princess." Leg was puzzled, but did not say much, until she walked into the main hall of the East Palace. Mammy Li and a few palace maids knelt on the ground, their shoulders shrank, and their bodies trembled violently. This group of slaves went overboard and rammed the crown princess, and asked Your Highness to express how to deal with it. After finishing speaking, An Xian waited quietly, waiting for instructions. Leg looked at Huodu, and saw that he was also looking at her, with a faint smile on his face. Then he reached out to her. In a familiar scene, the fear of having her arm unloaded struck, and a trace of fear flashed in her eyes. But in front of everyone, she didn't dare to go against his will. The door of the main hall was not closed, and the cold wind blew in. Leg shivered and put his hand on his palm. "My palms are as cold as last night." However, this time he just held her hand lightly and gently rubbed the back of her hand with his fingertips. It's a picture of a full-fledged flounder. Since it collided with the crown princess, let the crown princess handle it. Gentle voice, with the meaning of complete pampering and maintenance. Everyone kneeling on the ground was shocked, and looked up at Leg in panic. Especially Mammy Li, who obviously did not expect that the crown prince would take this princess of the country into his heart. Leg wasn't fooled by his gentle and indulgent appearance. Although she knew that she had a face that everyone praised. But after last night, she was sure that Huodu was by no means a foolish person. I don't know what he meant by this move. How could Leg dare to accept his words? I'm new here and I don't understand many of the rules of the East Palace, so I'll leave it to Your Highness to deal with it. She deliberately used the title I. First, it was just given by Huoduyun, and secondly, it was to let the people in the East Palace know that in front of the prince, she could still ignore the title, but any minions who had a little brains would definitely not dare to bully again after that. And pushing the right of disposal to Huodu shows that she will not be arrogant and arrogant. Watertight. Hearing this, Huodu did not speak immediately. After a while, he suddenly smiled. Then go by the old rules. An Xian nodded and said yes. At this moment, the maid who was kneeling on the ground and wearing a pale yellow palace dress suddenly raised her head, with tears on her cheeks, and exclaimed in alarm, "Your Highness! This is Mammy Li's idea." Immediately, he pointed to another palace maid, and her. "It's Swipazi that Jing Xin said that His Royal Highness is sleeping on the palace's happy bed." Swipazi. She wanted to go on, but she didn't dare. Hearing this, Leg's face flushed slightly, then turned white again. She knew exactly what Swipazi represented. An Xian on the side was always indifferent, but when the maid pointed at Jing Xin, a cold light flashed in her eyes. Noisy. Huodu spat out a word. An Xian and the guards outside took all the palace maids down. The main hall returned to a cold silence. Huodu let go of Leg's hand and continued to caress the snowball on his knees. Leg quickly hid his sweaty hands in his sleeves. She didn't know where those palace maids would be taken, let alone what the old rules Huodu was talking about. She also didn't think her princess was much better than them. As long as Huodu moved her fingers, she would be like those palace maids at any time. Not long after, An Xian came back. He still saluted respectfully, but what he said surprised Leg. I saw him bowing to Huodu and said solemnly, "Your Highness, this minister must protect Jingxin." He didn't beg, and there wasn't even a hint of begging in his tone. The main hall was large and empty, and Xian's words seemed to be echoed, but his indifferent face was still not very emotional. Leg looked at Huodu, trying to find out how he would react. It seems that An Xian is his closest bodyguard, will he allow it? I saw Huodu chuckle and raised his eyes, but he didn't look surprised. He didn't ask the reason, he just said, yes. Are the rules clear? Hearing this, An Xian's expression loosened, as if he was relieved. After nodding his head and saying yes, he turned around and walked away without thanking him. Huodu glanced sideways at Leg, who was at a loss, to see the doubts on her face. It's not surprising that she would wonder. He and the people below him have their own set of rules. He does not like to beg, nor does he like others to beg him. It is useless to ask for this word. He likes exchange of equal value, and if he wants to get something from him, he will exchange it for something of equal value. You can only get what you want by paying the price. It's fair. But Huodu slightly curled his lips and looked at the person beside him. Today, the 5 kingdoms are separated, and the 3 major tribes are attached to the state of Qi. Everyone knows that the country of Lebanon is governed by benevolence and kindness, and even ordinary people of the country of Lebanon are friendly and different from those of other countries. And now, the Li kingdom is destroyed. Just now, he waited for a long time, wanting to wait for the former princess of Li kingdom to plead for those palace maids. But I don't know if it was the pain of subjugation that wiped out her kindness, or she was not a kind person, or she wanted to endure the humiliation and do something for Huosu. After all, he didn't wait for her to speak. It's a pity, if she speaks, he will let her replace the palace maids alone. Look, he's planning to do a loss-making business. Ah! Plus last night, this is the 3rd time. His crown princess is really lucky. Su Shi sat on Huodu's lap for too long, and Xue Tuan jumped down with a meow and ran outside the hall to play. Perhaps it was the rumor that Mammy Li collided with the crown princess. At this time, the dining officer trembled and entered the hall with the recipe book. Xiaoguan, please see His Royal Highness and concubine, this is the recipe for today's lunch, if you need it. To add food, please also express your highness. Huodu waved his hand casually, show it to the crown princess. Lazi took the meal note in response, and his eyes widened as soon as he saw it. Too exaggerated, this lunch seems to be a grand banquet. It seems that the people below are quite frightened. The food matches so well. Leg bowed slightly and showed Huodu the food sheet. Your Highness, take a look, do you have anything else to add? The princess is satisfied. The dining officer put down the boulder in his heart and wanted to retire and leave. Wait. Huodu said again, prepare a few more fish meals. Leg leaned back softly on the mahogany chair, and Huodu had been away for a while. Her palms and back were still sweating coldly, and the feeling of fear enveloped her whole body. She has self-knowledge, and what Huodu did just now was definitely not to protect her or give her power. So what does he mean? She couldn't understand. Huosu had told her before that Huodu was a wolf. No, I'm afraid it's more than that. As soon as he sits there, it can bring a suffocating sense of oppression. Master. Leg returned to her senses, and Li Yao looked at her with a worried face. What happened? The servants just saw the guards escorting Li Ma and the others. Can you see where they were taken? Li Yao shook his head. The guards' faces were as cold as frost, and the slaves didn't dare to look at them, let alone keep up. After a pause, she said again, why don't the servants go and find out? No. Leg commanded in a deep voice, you shouldn't know about this, and you shouldn't mention it outside, do you know? In this huge East Palace, who can play tricks under Huodu's nose? Mammy Li just made a few words of nonsense, and he knew it right away. How dare she act rashly? After Li Yao nodded in agreement, he took out the cake wrapped in his sleeve, looked at Leg's haggard face, and asked softly, then do you still use this cake, master? Use. The chill was overwhelming, and Leg ordered Li Yao to make a pot of hot tea and eat it with cakes. The entrance of the pastry is rough and the taste is not good, and I still ate a few mouthfuls of cola sticks. But thinking of a hearty lunch, she didn't dare to be completely full. The hot tea entered her stomach, and her body gradually warmed up. The heat wafting from the teacup brushed over her eyes, making her eyes a little blurry. Hizzy, live well, forget all this, don't take revenge. This was the last word Father Huangshu said to her. She could only promise half of it. She will live well. From now on, she will not let herself be hungry, cold, or sick, she will work hard to live. But the hatred of subjugation will never be forgotten. The enmity of destroying the country is never ending. When he walked out of the main hall wrapped in a snow-white cotton cloak, snowflakes began to float outside. His underwear was soaked by the cold sweat on his back. At this time, the cold wind was blowing, and Leg couldn't help shivering, and the pace of walking towards the dormitory also accelerated. But before taking a few steps, a thin figure appeared to stop her. After she stopped, the palace maid knelt down and kowtowed in front of her. "My servant, thank the crown princess for saving her life." "A life-saving grace?" Leg frowned. "Who are you?" The palace maid raised her head slightly, and saw her eyes were clear and bright. Her eyes were red, and her face was pale, but it was not ugly to be born with a beautiful appearance. Leg felt a little familiar. "The slave is Jing Xin." It turned out to be her, the maid who specially went to see Shuepazi on the bed of the bedchamber. She didn't know that An Xian protected her. "Get up first." Leg looked at the cold ground and said, "Who told you that I saved you?" "The guards took us halfway, and released the slaves, saying that the crown princess asked for mercy for me." Before Jing Xin got up, he kowtowed to Lazi again, and choked, "The slaves are subject to Li Ma. It is an unforgivable sin for you to persecute your highness and the crown princess. I would like to thank the crown princess for your kindness. It seems that An Xian is deliberately hiding from her." "Get up." Leg asked Li Yaozhong to help him up, and asked, "Where are you on duty now?" "Back to the crown princess, the slave servant is on duty in the pantry." Lazi nodded, "Okay, let's go back. It's cold outside recently, so wear more clothes." Jing Xin nodded and gave another big gift before turning around and leaving. The snow was getting bigger and bigger, and snow fell on Lazi's black hair and eyelashes. She hurriedly walked to the bedroom. After stepping into the bedroom and looking around, Leg heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, Huodu was not in the bedroom. Li Yao helped her change the wet clothes, and gave her a pink palace dress. After she changed, she wrapped her a fluffy snow-white cloak. The chill gradually subsided. Not long after, a palace servant entered the palace and invited her to the dining room for lunch. Unlike breakfast, there is now a table full of delicacies. Sushi was not used to having people around when he was eating, and the servants all retreated outside the hall to wait for orders. She and Huodu were the only two left in the dining room. Leg ate slowly, sip by sip, looking serious. The person beside him suddenly put down the silver chopstick. "Lazi." Hearing him speak, Leg hurriedly put down the silver chopsticks and looked up at him. "Your Highness, please speak." Huodu chuckled, "Are you not fond of talking at all, or are you too afraid of me?" Leg lowered her eyes and was at a loss for words. In the past, she was most fond of laughing and making troubles, but now she has to ponder 7 points in her head to answer a sentence. Huodu picked up the silver spoon and slowly poured a bowl of soup and handed it to her. "If it's because of what happened last night, I apologize, but I won't in the future." Leg raised his head sharply, only to see his peach blossom eyes full of sincerity, a hint of apology in his eyes, and a look of guilt on his face. Until many years later, when Leg leaned on his shoulder and admired the moon, recalling this scene, he couldn't help laughing. This guy is quite trustworthy. What she didn't know was that what Huodu was thinking at the moment was no matter what purpose she came to him with, it's really not bad to be so calm. It's worth giving her a quick death. Taking the soup, Leg showed a smile, blinked again, and said softly, My Highness and I are husband and wife, I don't blame your Highness, and I will not be afraid of your Highness. Huodu hooked his lips and smiled even more. As expected of the stunning, a pair of seductive fox eyes can speak. No man in this world can escape such a beauty trick, right? But he already had a heart like a mirror. The more beautiful something is, the more untouchable it is. As for desire, of course he has. People have 5 desires: wealth, fame, food, sleep, and sex. Wealth and fame have long been ignored by him, and he has excellent control over food and sleep. Only this humiliation/desire is left. Ah! What's more difficult? During a lunch, both of them were not very attentive. After putting down the silver chopsticks, Leg was still thinking about whether his answer would satisfy Huodu. Full. Leg raised her eyes, looked at Huodu's peach blossom eyes, and nodded with a smile. The person in front of him glanced at the fish meal on the table and raised his eyebrows, then don't fight for food with Huoziali. Hey! Hearing this, Leg was surprised. Huo, little lame. Snowball, who had been dozing off quietly on Huodu's lap, suddenly opened his eyes to look at Leg, with round cat eyes, as if he was a little bit puzzled. Huodu stretched out his hand and pressed his head, letting him continue to sleep. Then he raised his eyes to look at Leg, as if afraid of disturbing Huo Xiao again. He lowered his voice and said, Its name. Now, Leg was even more puzzled. She has also seen some people with disabilities before. No matter how optimistic they are in front of others, if they accidentally mention their disabilities, they will still feel inferior and speechless. She always thought that Huodu's leg disease should be his taboo. However, he didn't care to mention the word lame, and even gave his cat a name like this: Huoziaki. The name is Tu. I don't know why Zioxu Tuan is lame. Because I'm lame, my cat has to have a broken leg too. Leg's smile froze for a moment, and she raised her eyes in shock before she even had time to adjust her expression. Looking at each other, she saw Huodu's lacquer eyes shining brightly, with a playful smile on his face. Seeing that both of them put down the silver chopsticks, the waiter outside brought in the hot tea after dinner with a wink. Lazi quickly picked up the teacup, and the familiar fragrance floated to his nose. She took a sip, and the elegant taste slipped into her throat with a hint of bitterness, but the aftertaste was sweet. Thanks to this tea, it gave her a lot of time to suppress the tremor in her heart. Prince Concubine, the servants don't know what kind of tea you like to drink, so I prepared this tea for you according to His Highness's preference. The servant bowed and said, If you are not used to drinking it, the servants will change it immediately. Tea is good, you should leave first. The waiter breathed a sigh of relief, then saluted, and then retreated to the door. Leg put down the teacup, looked at Huodu, and said softly, Your Highness is joking. In response to what he said. After the initial shock, Leg recalled the concern he showed for Huoziali, without pretending at all. More importantly, Huoziali is also very affectionate to him. The nature of animals is the most real, and if Huodu had really hurt it, it would never be able to rest on him as comfortably as it is now. Huodu didn't say a word, just took the teacup and finished the tea. Then he slowly pushed the wheelchair to leave the dining room. When the wheelchair came to the door, he sneered, If you don't like it, don't force it. Leg immediately reacted. Come to think of it, he already knew the way she frowned when she used night cinnamon for breakfast, and now her behavior is probably fake in his eyes. No, it should be more than that. She knew in her heart that although Emperor Qi gave her the marriage, Huodu would not have known that she was the person Huosu arranged to be by his side, so her every move should be classified as a poor performance, right? I don't know where the courage came from. She got up in a hurry, His Royal Highness. The person sitting in the white jade wheelchair did not turn around, but just put his right palm on the handle, and his slender fingers tapped irregularly. Nothing I don't like. I was just not used to the taste at first, but when I taste it again, it has a different taste. I really think this tea is excellent. Although he knew he wouldn't believe it, Kola Branch still said it. And these words are indeed true. This night saffron is really different from eating it directly. Drinking it after a meal is very clear to the stomach. She really likes it. Besides, the hazy plan in her heart seemed to be getting clearer and clearer. Then she wanted to say all of her attitude towards Huosu and Huosu's purpose for getting her closer to him. However, not yet. Now is not the best time. Follow me. Not knowing where Huodu was going, Leg only responded warmly and quickly followed him. Until he stepped into the bedroom, Leg thought he wanted to take a lunch break, but Huodu turned his wheelchair to the mahogany table in the hall. Leg followed his line of sight and looked over. I don't know when the mahogany table is full of piles. Those things are brand new and luxurious, like a wedding gift? Lazi guessed what he meant and pushed him to the table. Choose a favorite. Among the dazzling array of gold and silver jewelry, gemstones, agate, and famous books and pictures, there is something out of place. It was a white jade flute. Leg picked up the jade flute subconsciously and was stunned. Her imperial elder sister, talented and beautiful, is best at playing the qin and flute. In the past, when she was free, she liked to sit in the Mufeng pavilion listening to her sister's flute and dozed off lazily. Seeing her like this, Huodu understood. He called out the servants to enter the hall, and told them to throw away all the remaining gifts. Leg returned to his senses, and couldn't help but be dumbfounded. All lost. Huodu curled his lips, naturally took the jade flute away from her hand, and said calmly, naturally. Except for the favorite, everything else is useless. After he finished speaking, he pushed the wheelchair towards the bed. Leg was puzzled. How could those precious treasures become useless? She doesn't understand. She didn't understand Huodu's words, let alone Huodu. When she turned around, Huodu was already lying lazily on the bed, still holding the book he had flipped through last night. And Huoziaki slept on Huodu's lap for a long time. When he woke up, he dragged his lame leg back and forth excitedly. Leg slowly approached the bed, suddenly at a loss, not knowing what to do. Want to sleep? Huodu looked up at her. This is a random question. Leg shook his head and asked softly, can I walk around in the East Palace? Yes. Huodu said lightly, in the East Palace, besides me, you are the biggest. Do you understand? Leg nodded dumbfoundedly. A bit like being a master. Being bullied by a minion. He didn't say anything in the second half of the sentence. Kokachi seemed to be able to guess what he didn't say from the sarcasm in his eyes. Being bullied by a slave is a waste. Leg pursed her lips and turned around to leave, but Huodu called out to her again. She looked at the bed and saw Huodu raised his hand and gently pinched Huoziali's lame ear next to him. When someone pinched his ears, Huo Xiao meowed uncomfortably, and stretched out two cat claws to grab Huodu's hand. Nei's claws were too short, so he could only flutter twice in the air, unable to touch Huodu's fingertips at all. Seeing this, Leg hurriedly responded, then rescued Huoziali and held him in his arms. Huoziali stuck his round head out of Leg's arms and continued to meow dissatisfiedly at Huodu. Huodu lazily raised his eyelids and glanced at it. Oh, stupid cat with no conscience. Qi is located in the north, and it is extremely cold in winter. The white snow came one after another, and it seemed that it never stopped, and the snow on the ground was accumulating more and more. Leg didn't let Li Yao follow him, wrapped in a thick fox fur, holding Huoziali and wandering aimlessly in the spacious courtyard. Cotton boots stepped on the snow, making a rustling sound. After walking for a long time, Leg's arm was also sore. She lifted her arm up, smiled and whispered, I can't see, you are quite heavy. Huo Xiaoli, who was in his arms, seemed to understand what she was saying, and lightly bumped her palm with his round head. This large east palace is surrounded by palaces, but there are not many eunuchs and guards in the palace. Leg was tired from walking, so he walked into the stone pavilion beside Merlin to rest. But as soon as I sat down, I heard footsteps from far to near, accompanied by whispered discussions. What can I do? Lorden is bleeding all over, and most of his life is gone. What happened? How could your highness suddenly condemn Lorden? It seems to have something to do with the group of palace maids who collided with the crown princess, otherwise why should the adults be punished with them? Be quiet. Talk about this, be careful. Let's find a way to get some medicine for Lord An. A few red plum trees just blocked the stone pavilion, and the guards did not notice anyone in the stone pavilion. It wasn't until after approaching and seeing Leg's figure that he knelt down and saluted in surprise and fear, his voice trembling slightly, with an unstoppable panic. Leg was surprised, and now everyone in the East Palace seems to regard her as a beast of a flood. She asked them to get up and asked, "Master An is seriously injured?" Hearing this, the three guards looked at each other, their faces pale and dare not speak. Seeing this, Leg didn't force it, but said, "Go get the medicine. If someone else asks, just say what I mean." The guards were stunned for a while, then nodded happily and thanked them, and then hurried to get the medicine. If there is no master's consent in the East Palace, those who have been punished will definitely not be healed. Now that the princess has spoken, it seems that Lorden is saved. Let's go back to. Leg bowed his head. Then he drew the fox fur to his body, so as not to let the cold wind blow to Huo Xiaoli. But not long after she left, she saw Li Yao hurried over. "Master, your majesty has returned to the palace." Li Yao took a few breaths, and then said, "Your majesty will hold a palace banquet in Yule Hall tonight, and I have passed an order to invite his royal highness to join you." Leg frowned and nodded. "Come back early and come back late, always come back." After sending Huo Xiaoli back to the warm cat house, Leg returned to the bedroom. Huo Du has not woken up yet. It's just, only a corner of the quilt was draped over his waist, and he was wearing only a thin nightgown. Leg reached out and touched the back of his hand, and sure enough, there was no trace of warmth. It was still early for the palace banquet, and Leg thought that he could sleep a little longer, so he didn't even ask to wake him up. She unfolded the quilt and wrapped it around him. Then he went to the bathroom, ready to change into a more grand palace outfit. Huo Du had always slept lightly, and woke up when Leg approached the bed. He didn't open his eyes until she covered him with the quilt and turned around. Lazi's thin and slender back is printed under his eyes. Huo Du's face was expressionless, and doubts arose in his heart. Soon, Leg changed into the big red palace dress, and specially chose a gilded step to wear, a luxurious and dignified dress. Huo Du saw her come out, his lacquer eyes were heavy, and he quickly turned his head. "Your Highness is awake." Leg approached the bed. Huo Du hummed lightly. "Your Majesty." The royal father set up a palace banquet and announced that we will go to the banquet. Leg smiled and stretched out his hand, "I will help His Highness to get up." Huo Du looked at her jade-like palm, puzzled. Ming deliberately broke her arm last night, and she was scared to death just looking at her. How dare you approach him again and again? For Huo Su, it's too humiliating, right? It's a pity not to go to the theater for this acting. He suddenly wanted to smash her head to see what was going on in her head. But just think about it. The beauty's head is broken, but it's not good looking. He smiled, but did not refuse, and placed his hand on her palm. Leg handed the white jade crutch to him. "Am I serving His Highness to wash up?" "No." Huo Du simply refused. Leg sat on the collapse and waited for him. After a while, Huo Du put on a suit with white gold pattern, the most ordinary palace suit, but it didn't look so ordinary when he wore it on him. Daoist people rely on clothes, but it's not the same. To Huodu, there was a feeling of being lined with clothes. Leg got up and approached him, raised his hand to smooth out the slightly wrinkled collar on his body, and said with a natural expression, "I heard that Mr. N was seriously injured, so I made a presumptive proposition and asked someone to get him some medicine. Your Highness will blame me for being meddlesome." Hearing this, Huodu didn't answer her words, he just smiled and said, "Have you seen An Xian?" The hand on the collar paused, and Leg raised her eyes to look at the pair of peach blossom eyes that seemed to be smiling but not smiling, but she did not panic. She hooked her lips and smiled brightly, "It doesn't look like it, at most it's Iwu." This time, Huodu's face really showed a little smile. If beauty is dangerous, smart beauty is even more dangerous. But, so what? For the first time in his heart, Huodu thanked his imperial brother for sending such an interesting person to him. Interesting. So fun. The East Palace was not far from the Yule Hall, and Lazi knew that Huodu had no intention of passing the sedan chair, so he knew that he was going to walk over. At dusk, the lights on both sides of the palace road were lit. The two walked side by side, with a group of attendants following behind them, a few steps away from them. Huodu was leaning on crutches, but his back was straight and he walked leisurely. Leg stood beside him, holding one of his hanging hands. Neither of them spoke until they saw Huosu's figure appearing not far away. Huosu was wearing a cyan round neck shirt and a cotton cloak today. Next to him was a little girl who was jumping around. "Brother Aksu, you agreed to ask for the peace charm for me." The little girl was wearing a bright yellow palace dress, and her silver bell-like voice was particularly clear in the quiet palace road. Huosu apparently saw them too, stopped unconsciously and looked at Lazi uncontrollably. Seeing this, Huodu felt a burst of joy in his heart. He looked sideways, wanting to see Leg's expression at this time. Surprised, sad, or angry? Unfortunately, none of them. She didn't even look at the two people in the distance, but just looked at him with a smile on her face, and put the sleeve furnace in his hand into his hand, slightly annoyed. "I asked His Highness to wear a big cloak before going out, His Highness did not listen, and now it is frozen." Bar. Huodu's face changed slightly. "Cold? How cold is this?" After a moment of ecstasy, the person in the distance has come to the two of them. Huosu and the little girl beside him all saluted respectfully. "The Emperor's brother greets the Emperor's brother and sister-in-law. The ministers and daughters see His Royal Highness and Crown Princess." Huodu smiled lightly and said no gift. Leg only nodded slightly, and the two continued to walk forward. Looking at the backs of the two leaving, a strange feeling flashed in Huosu's heart, and suddenly he even felt that the two walking together were unusually harmonious and well suited. Must be overthinking it. Such a gloomy person, it is impossible for Zhizi to like it. It's just pretending. "Big brother Aksu, big brother Aksu." The person beside him tugged at the corner of his clothes. Huosu retracted his gaze, suppressed the irritability in his heart, took out the peace talisman in his sleeve and handed it to her with a smile. A smile instantly appeared on the little girl's face. In the Yule Hall, there was a lot of laughter. It was not until they shouted, "The Emperor and the Queen are here," that the hall was quiet. Empress Qi sat down in the center of the hall, and both of them smiled at the corners of their eyes. Although today is a palace banquet, it is also a family banquet, so all the Ikings don't have to be restrained. This is the second time Leg has seen Emperor Qi. Last time, Huosu took her into the palace. She knelt in front of Emperor Qi. Emperor Qi looked down at her and said, "It is common for the two countries to fight casualties. Your father, it is not wise for the Queen Mother to choose to commit suicide. I see you as a smart child and should not do stupid things." Then he said that he would give her to the prince as his wife, and to make the two countries marry each other, and they would become a family from now on. But she knew very well that even if she was locked up in the post house, she would have heard how the Qi state brutally destroyed the Li state, which aroused the anger of the neighboring countries. Emperor Qi move was only to quell the anger of the neighboring country. Emperor Qi Huo Changjiun was born with a majestic appearance. Even if he is no longer young, it is not difficult to see the heroic and fierceness on his face. As early as when he first ascended the throne and held the power of the emperor, he loved the East and West wars. 12 years ago, he launched a war against Zhang, Wu, and Ning with the strength of the whole country, forcing the three countries to resist together, and finally was beaten and retreated. When the kingdom was nearly destroyed, Li's father, the young Emperor Li, intervened to persuade the three kingdoms to truce. But the three kingdoms have lingering fears. How can they give up easily? After deliberation, we finally settled on a best of both worlds approach. Let Huo Changjiun's son enter the country of Li as a pledge to restrain his behavior. So, the 6-year-old Huo Su came to Li country like this. When the 4-year-old Li Ji saw Huo Su, the royal father hugged her and sat on his knees, and said to her in a warm voice, "This is brother Huo Su from Qi, my brother came here from his hometown, and Zhi wants to be nice to him." Oh! The little girl blinked ignorantly and nodded happily. After her father and mother, her elder brother and elder sister sincerely regarded Huo Su as a family, and she also regarded him as her own elder brother since childhood. Who knows, it took 12 years to raise a living witty-eyed wolf. It's a pity that your majesty and Ben Gong are not here for Duer's big wedding. Queen Qi was dressed in a phoenix robe, elegant and luxurious. Come and have a drink with Queen Mother. After Huo Du raised his glass, he put the glass back on the table and didn't drink. Look, Ben Gong is confused and forgets that Duer never drinks. Queen Qi laughed. Li drank the wine and looked at the person beside him. Never drink? No wonder he didn't smell of alcohol on his wedding night, and he didn't even drink a glass of wine with her. However, it is not a marriage that you love and I want, and it is normal not to drink a glass of wine. At this moment, Huo Du also glanced sideways at her, and immediately pushed the wine glass in front of him towards her. This is to make her drink for him. Li Ji smiled, picked up the glass and drank the wine. This scene fell in the eyes of Qi Ho, and I was very happy. This girl is still aware of current affairs. As long as she doesn't pester her, it's okay to keep her alive. Huo Du looked at Li Ji's blushing cheeks, smiled and approached her ear, teasing softly, "I'm good at drinking, lonely princess." Huo Su, who was sitting opposite, saw the two of them being intimate, and his heart was twisted like a knife, but he couldn't show it on his face. "Your Majesty, now Duer is married. Shouldn't Suer's marriage be decided as well?" When Empress Qi said this, her tone was full of tenderness, and she didn't have any hypocrisy when she spoke to Huo Du just now. Because this queen is the successor. Huo Du's biological mother died early, and the current Queen Qi was nothing more than a noble concubine back then, so it was Huo Su, not Huo Du, who went to Li State as a pledge. However, time has changed, and now Huo Su has also changed from a concubine to a second son. Exactly. Emperor Qi was in high spirits today, so he drank a few more cups. Then good things will come in pairs. The Prime Minister's daughter, Shen Qingjian, is gentle and graceful. I will make the decision today and marry the third prince, Huo Su. What does the Prime Minister think? Hearing this, Prime Minister Shen Hui hurriedly stood up, kneeling down with a smile on his face and thanking him. Then, Huo Su suppressed the reluctance in his eyes, and thanked Shen Qingjian beside him. Shen Qingjian's eyes were full of joy, looking at Huo Su beside him, with deep nostalgia in her eyes. Li Ji sneered in his heart. Emperor Qi conferred the marriage of the Prime Minister's daughter to Huo Su, but gave Huo Du her a princess who had nothing now. It's really eccentric. After the palace banquet was over, Huo Duping retired from the attendant and walked slowly to the East Palace with the winter moonlight and Li Ji. Li Ji naturally took his arm and walked beside him. Li. Huo Du chuckled, Xiao Zima is going to marry someone else, how do you feel? Leg was slightly startled, but he didn't expect him to ask so directly. I said I don't feel anything, does your highness believe it? Leg smiled, knowing that Huodu probably wouldn't believe what he said. In fact, she really didn't feel anything in her heart. Believe? Then may I ask your highness a question? Ask. Huodu seemed to be in a good mood tonight. The Lady Shen has a distinguished status, and the maiden's family she relies on is the honor of the Prime Minister. And I have nothing now, so I can't give any support to His Highness. Su Shi drank 2 glasses of strong wine, and Leg felt that he was more courageous. Quite a few, marry me, does your highness feel that it's a loss? It's not a loss. Huodu replied simply, you are much prettier than Shen Qingjian. Leg smiled and replied, His Royal Highness looks better. Hearing this, Huodu stopped, and Leg had to stop as well, looking at him suspiciously. The moonlight was bright, shining on his face, making the cheeks of the two of them as white as jade. Huodu leaned against Lazi, and with her strength, raised his cane and tapped his right leg, snorted, it's useless to look good, but he's just a lame man. Leg smiled and supported him, letting him lean on himself, it's just that he walks slower than others. Her eyes are sincere and tender. Huodu suddenly felt irritable in his heart. He didn't speak, just pushed her away gently, and after a distance from her, he continued to walk forward with a cane. After arriving at the East Palace, Huodu went straight to the study and sat for a long time. It wasn't until late at night that he returned to the bedroom. The people on the bed had closed their eyes, and Huodu lay down on the outside, watching her quietly. I saw her eyelashes trembling slightly, obviously not asleep. Huodu didn't say anything to dismantle her since he likes acting so much, he will invite her to see a good show tomorrow. Let's see if she can keep going. He imagined in his mind the reaction she might have, and the corners of his mouth twitched unconsciously. Early the next morning, when Leg woke up, Huodu was no longer on the bed. She got up quickly, today is the first day of the new year, and she needs to go to the Queen to say goodbye. She didn't have time to think about where Huodu had gone, so she hurriedly dressed and rushed to Yongning Palace. See the Queen Mother. No gift, give a seat. After being seated, the Queen showed a gentle smile, and introduced everyone to Leg one by one. All present were some concubines and concubines, as well as Shen Qingjian, whom she had seen at the palace banquet yesterday, who was sitting intimately beside the Queen at this time. On the other side of the Queen sat a young woman, looking at her with unfriendly eyes. This is the little niece of Ben Gong's mother's family, Lin Yuxian. The Queen smiled and said, I haven't seen the royal sister-in-law yet. Lin Yuxian's appearance is different from Shen Qingjian's gentleness, with a domineering look in his eyebrows, a bit like the Queen. She pursed her lips and stood up, and reluctantly saluted Lazi, I have seen the Queen's wife. Leg smiled lightly, don't be too polite. The Yongning Palace was full of joy, Lazi laughed and chatted with everyone, and had some hot tea and snacks. Finally, the Queen was a little tired, and everyone resigned with a wink. Li Yao walked out of Yongning Palace with Lazi in his arms, and only took a few steps when a bright voice came from behind, sister-in-law, stay. Leg turned around and saw Lin Yuxian hurriedly walking in front of her. She bowed her body and bowed slightly before saying, I just arrived in Daki, so there must be some things I don't know. Appreciate further details. Then I'll say it straight. Lin Yuxian bit his lip, his face flushed a little, if it wasn't for my uncle who insisted on marrying me, it would be me who would marry the prince's brother now. Leg was stunned for a moment, and then a faint smile appeared on his face. I see. No wonder the little girl didn't have a good look on her. Although you are the prince concubine now, the prince brother won't like you. He will marry me sooner or later. Looking at Lin Yu's virtuous face, Leg nodded, okay, I see. Looking at Leg's indifferent back, Lin Yuxian was dumbfounded, is she not angry or worried at all? Does this mean that she has no intentions of the prince's brother? If so, that would be great. Back in the East Palace, Huodu was still not seen, but An Xian, who was pale and slightly sick. See the crown prince. An Xian bowed and said, His Royal Highness has returned to the prince's mansion. Let the minister wait here for you to come back and take you to the prince's mansion. Lazi nodded and said yes. An Xian thanked her again. Thank you, the crown princess, for giving the medicine. It's just a small matter, Mr. An doesn't need to be too polite. The prince's mansion was not far from the palace, and it was quickly reached by horse-drawn carriage. Prince Concubine, Your Highness invites you to enjoy the show together. Leg had just entered the mansion gate with his forefoot. When he heard the words, he was slightly taken aback, and then he said, Then ask Lord An to lead the way. An Xian looked at Li Yao beside her, but did not speak. Leg knew what he meant, so he left Yao and asked her to go to the bedroom to clean up. Following An Xian towards the east courtyard, Lazi was not in the mood to take a closer look at the mansion's scenery along the way, and only thought about what Huodu wanted her to see. Unconsciously, An Xian stopped in front of an attic. I will send you here. Your Highness has an order, please go in alone. Leg nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped into the attic. As soon as she entered the room, a familiar smell floated into her nose. Although it was very light, it made her scalp tingle instantly. Its smell. It was a little dark in the attic, and Lazi suppressed the discomfort in his stomach and called softly, Your Highness. Come up. Huodu's voice came from the second floor. Leg walked up the stairs step by step, the hand hanging by his side trembled slightly, and the smell of blood floating into his nose became stronger and stronger. The attic is paved with mahogany, even the stairs. Huodu listened to the sound of footsteps stepping on the stairs getting closer and closer, and the smile on his face became stronger and stronger. Until a pale red figure came into view. It turned out that she was wearing a red skirt today. That's fine. Huodu tapped the mahogany table with his index finger knuckles, and said lightly, Come and sit. After Leg sat firmly on the armchair beside the mahogany table, he set his eyes on the front. It was a half-height stage, and it was much smaller than an ordinary stage. There was also a mahogany stake on top. But she didn't believe that Huodu had invited her to the show. On the contrary, a creepy feeling rose in her heart. This attic, this stage, is full of weirdness. Do you like sweets? Leg tilted her head and saw that Huodu was pouring her hot tea, still the familiar cool taste. She hummed absently. Huodu smiled, stretched out his hand and took the small cup on the side, opened the lid, and a thick sweetness wafted out. It's a cup of syrup. He frowned slightly, obviously disliking the sweet taste. However, he still patiently poured some syrup into the tea and mixed it with a small silver spoon before pushing it to Lazi's hand. The wedding was in a hurry, and I didn't prepare a decent present for you. Huodu's tone was indifferent. After thinking about it, I would like to invite you to a good show together. This is Gu Ping's favorite pastime. Crown Princess, would you like to show your face? He said a question sentence, but there was a bit of indifference in his tone. How dare Lazi say no? She nodded and said okay. After speaking, a man covered in blood and disheveled was dragged onto the stage by his attendants and tied to a mahogany stake. Then the squire presents the delicate and small bow/crossbow. Huodu looked at the slightly startled person beside him, and said slowly, You come first or I come first? Leg raised his eyes in astonishment, unable to speak. Come what? Sorry, I forgot you wouldn't. After a pause, he bewitched again, Come here then. Since he said so, Lazi had to do as he did. Sit down. Leg stood in front of Huodu with wide eyes. There is no chair beside him. Is it because he wants her to sit on his? Seeing her stunned, Huodu sneered, It's just that my calf is broken, so I can't sit badly. After he finished speaking, he was not in a hurry, but looked at Leg's face calmly, with a hint of teasing. Leg had to bite the bullet and sit lightly on his lap, not daring to put the weight of his body on it. Seeing this, Huodu raised his hand to wrap around her slender waist, and slightly forced her to get closer to him. Confusion, panic, embarrassment. All kinds of emotions appeared on Leg's face all of a sudden, all of which fell into Huodu's eyes. Even the palm of his light circle around her slender waist could clearly feel the trembling of her body. Oh, he thought she was so calm. That's it. It hasn't even started yet. Shake like this? Huodu picked up the bow/crossbow on the table and slowly raised his hand. Leg stared blankly at his face. Gu's face is very beautiful, but... He curled his fingers around Leg's waist, pinched her waist lightly, and raised his eyebrows. Let's watch the show first. Leg looked away and looked towards the center of the stage. Immediately afterwards, a wind of arrows brushed past her left ear, and the cold silver arrow went straight into the man's thigh, splattering red blood. The man opened his mouth but made no sound because of him. He has lost his tongue. The stage was not far from them, and the smell of blood immediately drifted away. It's crooked. Huodu glanced at the stage and shook his head regretfully. Leg covered his mouth and suppressed the tumbling in his stomach. After the bloodbath scene a month ago, she thought she would be able to adapt, but she still felt nauseated by the smell of blood. She turned her head, not wanting to look any more. It's so uncomfortable. Huodu patted her back and shoved the bow/crossbow into her palm, touching the dampness. He chuckled softly, if you don't want him to suffer, then give him a treat. After he finished speaking, he moved his palm to the back of Leg's neck and caressed it to show encouragement. The two were so close to each other that Leg couldn't help shuddering, and the hand holding the bow/crossbow trembled. Fortunately, a cold hand grabbed her in time and took her hand together with the bow/crossbow. They raised them together. Don't be afraid, it's fun. Leg looked in the direction of the bow/crossbow, and saw Huodu's hand deflected, and the arrow aimed at the man's heart deflected to the left. Huodu did it on purpose. He didn't want that person to die happily at all. The man was dying, and there was no way he could survive. No matter how many arrows he shoots, he will die. So, before the silver arrow was fired, Leg quickly deflected his hand to the right. Call out, the silver arrow pierced through the heart, killing him instantly. This series of movements was too fast, and Huodu's lacquer eyes were obviously startled, and then he hooked his lips. Careless. His princess is really amazing. As soon as Huodu retracted his hand, Leg's hand holding the bow/crossbow loosened, and the bow/crossbow fell to the ground, making a heavy sound. Leg shivered and covered her heart with her hands, gasping for breath in horror. The heart seems to be jumping out, and the head is buzzing. She really did kill people. Are you so afraid? Huodu's tone was cool. Instead, he was looking forward to her next reaction. Is it resentment and panic? Or suffocated and dare not speak? Must be weird. After a while, Leg's breathing gradually became smoother. Then, she turned sideways to Huodu, put her hands on his shoulders, and her pale snow cheeks leaned closer to him. His Royal Highness, is this person a heinous villain? Hearing this, a trace of stunned peach blossoms couldn't help but flash in her eyes. This is not what he imagined. But in just a moment, Huodu's eyes returned to calm. He chuckled and shook his head. He is a good person with good conduct. Leg was very close to him, so as not to miss his eyes. Just a moment was enough, she guessed right. That person is by no means a good person. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Huodu could see that she didn't believe her words. Smart woman, it's really not fun. Excuse me. He impatiently pushed Leg's waist lightly and motioned her to get up. The play is over, come back. Leg bowed and saluted, and after responding softly, he walked away calmly. Walking out of the attic, Leg saw Li Yao, who was waiting outside the door. She closed the door of the attic to block the smell of blood inside. After taking a few more steps outside, the footsteps are already weak. Master. Li Yao frowned and said, "My servant will help you back to the house." There was heavy snow in the sky, and a thick layer of snow had accumulated on the ground. Leg walked very slowly, she couldn't lift her strength, and her underwear was already soaked with sweat. The cold wind made her shiver. She was leaning on Li Yao's body, her mind was blank. Huo Du leaned against the window of the attic, looking down at this scene, his lacquer eyes darkened. The little girl is still afraid. No matter how calm he was in front of him, he was still scared in the end. Isn't it the purpose of him to invite her to watch this play to make her afraid? But he was not as happy as expected. "Your Highness, what should I do with this corpse?" Huo Du glanced at the rotten meat on the stage with disgust, his face expressionless. "Chop it up and throw it into the wild to feed the wolves." "Yes." The attendant bowed in command. "Wait." He suddenly changed his mind, burned to ashes, raised. "Heinous villain? Oh, this beast is also worthy of being called a human?" Huo Du turned his head and turned his gaze to the snow outside. That slender figure had been blocked by a large piece of merlin, and could no longer be seen. His eyes darkened suddenly, and there was no emotion in his eyes. "Li Yao, prepare hot water, I want to take a bath." Li Yao nodded, hurried out of the dormitory, and called someone to boil hot water. The moment her whole body was immersed in the hot water, Lazi felt that she had come to life. She said to Li Yao next to her, "You are also tired today, so go and rest for a while. You don't need to call me for lunch or dinner." Li Yaozhou looked on his face, opened his mouth to persuade him, but in the end said nothing, nodded and left. Leg closed her eyes and held her breath, immersed her whole head in the water, and only raised her head out of the water when she had to breathe. She washed for a long, long time, until the water in the tub started to cool, and it was worth it. Finish bathing. Lying on the bed exhausted, Leg wrapped himself tightly with the quilt. No matter how long she washed, she still felt a faint smell of blood on her body. After today's encounter, her head was in a mess, but the plan that rose in her heart became clearer and clearer. She needs to think about it. Thinking about it, she couldn't help but get confused. Half dreaming, she seemed to see the father, mother, and elder brother, who were still surrounding her with laughter and laughter. Could it be that the destruction of the Li kingdom was just a dream? She opened her eyes suddenly, saw the strange bed curtain, raised her hand and touched her cheek, her face was slightly cold and wet. Looking up at the window, it was pitch black outside. There was a soft knock on the door master. It was Li Yao's voice. Leg raised his hand to dry the tears on his face, "Come in." Leaving Yao into the house, and then carefully closed the door. She walked to the front of the collapse with a dignified expression, bowed her body and said, "The third prince wants to see you." Leg's heart was slightly stagnant, and Huo Su was really impatient. "There are people from the third prince in the prince's mansion." Li Yao said softly, "The master can go out through the east back door, there will be no guards there." Leg nodded, "I see, you go down, don't make others suspicious." Li Yao Yinghao quickly left the dormitory. A red candle was lit on the table in the bedroom, and the heart of the candle was burning vigorously, making some crackling sounds. Leg stared at the candlelight for a while, and made a decision in his heart. She stayed and changed her dress and walked out of the dormitory, but she did not walk in the direction of the east back door. She stopped a maid at random and asked her where the crown prince was at the moment. "She is going to find Huo Du."